Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to the Mana Fix, where we cover Commander deck techs across various archetypes, budgets, and themes. Now, ever since Companions were announced, and particularly after the rules change, I've been hearing more than a few people say that playing a Companion in EDH will only make your deck worse. Now, while that may be true for some of the Companions, I do still think some of them are viable. The Companion I'd like to make a case for today is Gyruda, Doom of Depths. Gyruda costs 4 generic and 2 Dimir hybrid mana for a 6/6 legendary demon kraken. It says, when Gyruda enters the battlefield, each player puts the top 4 cards of their library into their graveyard. Put a creature card with even converted mana cost from among those cards onto the battlefield under your control. Gyruda also has the Companion ability, which means once per game, we can pay 3 generic mana to put it into our hand from outside the game as long as our deck meets the Companion restriction. Gyruda's restriction is that all of the cards in our deck must have an even converted mana cost. So if we follow this restriction, Gyruda acts as a 101st card in our deck, almost like a second commander. Actually, it's more like starting the game with a 3-cost tutor that can only get Gyruda. The reason this is not a second commander is because if Gyruda were to die or get exiled, we don't have the option of putting it back into the command zone to ensure we can play it later. This is one of the arguments against building your deck around a companion. However, I still believe this can work as long as your deck can continue to function without its companion. For starters, I chose Muldrotha as the commander because if Gyruda has to go to the graveyard at some point, Muldrotha is a commander that can get it back. Muldrotha the Gravetide is a 6/6 legendary elemental avatar for blue, green, black, and 3 other. It says during each of your turns, you may play up to 1 permanent card of each permanent type from your graveyard. So now the only way to permanently get rid of our companion is to exile it. And even if Gyruda does get exiled, Muldrotha is still a very powerful commander that will help the deck to function regardless of Gyruda being absent. Let's get into it here and see how this deck is going to play. Now, it should be a given that if our deck is based around casting a 6-drop creature, we need to have loads of mana ramp to make sure we're able to do that. Remember, we're restricted to cards with even converted mana costs, which does limit the cards we can use. Because of that, we're running the best 2 CMC mana dorks Magic has to offer. Incubation Druid, Leafkin Druid, and Elysian Caryatid are all 2 CMC mana dorks that have a little bit of upside. Incubation Druid has Adapt 3 for 5 mana. If we activate this ability, it's going to tap for 3 mana as opposed to just 1. Leafkin Druid taps for a green, but can tap for 2 green if we control 4 or more creatures. Now that's certainly not out of the realm of possibility with this deck and may actually be easier to achieve than you might think. Elysian Caryatid will be able to tap for 2 mana if we control a creature with power 4 or greater. Whisperer of the Wilds, Bloom Tender, and Gyre Sage are similar. Whisperer of the Wilds is another dork that can tap for 2 mana if we control a creature with power 4 or greater. Bloom Tender can potentially tap for one of each of our colors. Gyre Sage is an interesting card and one that has a low floor but an incredibly high ceiling. So this thing starts off without counters on it, so it's not going to tap for mana unless it has a +1/+1 counter on it. But it has Evolve, so anytime a creature with greater power or toughness comes into play, we put a +1/+1 counter on it. We have loads of creatures, including our commanders, that have power and or toughness greater than 1 and 2 respectively. Not to mention, we have blink effects in this deck which offers more opportunities to tick Gyre Sage up. Of course, Sakura Tribelder is in the deck as well. This is a cheap creature that offers land ramp, which as we all know is more safe than mana dorks. Oracle of Moldiah is in this deck too. Again, it's a creature that we can potentially get for free with Gyruda, and this is once again land ramp on a creature that provides card advantage for us as well. Similarly, Solemn Simulacrum is a creature that provides land ramp, and it does it when it enters the battlefield, which is definitely a plus in this deck with all of the blink effects we'll be running. Argothian Elder sort of acts as a mana dork for 4 CMC, but instead of outright adding mana to our mana pool, this one untaps 2 lands. This is nice not only because it lets us pick and choose what color lands to untap, but also because we can potentially ramp ourselves by more than 2 mana if we have out lands like Ancient Tomb or Temple of the False God. Now with our even CMC restriction, we do have to put a few ramp spells in the deck too. Nature's Lore and Rampant Growth are here. We're also running Skyshroud Claim, which can fetch Original Duels or Shock lands if you have them, and the strictly better Explosive Vegetation Migration Path. I'm so glad they printed this card because Explosive Vegetation was playable, but obviously this card is just better with that cycling pasted on. So once we've ramped, we obviously want to cast Gyruda as soon as we can to get some value from him. But one ETB trigger from this will not be enough, so we're running plenty of ways to do this over and over again. Teferi's Time Twist and Siren's Ruse are both 2 CMC options for blinking Gyruda. Teferi's Time Twist can be cast at instant speed, which is nice if we need to save Gyruda from a removal spell. We do have to wait until the end step for Gyruda to come back, however. Siren's Ruse is only sorcery speed, but the creature re-enters immediately, so it has a different upside there. Illusionist Stratagem and Rite of Replication are up next. Illusionist Stratagem is an instant that blinks not only 1, but 2 creatures. It also replaces itself with the card draw effect on it. Rite of Replication isn't a bounce effect per se, but it does help to create Gyruda triggers. This card is going to create a token that's a copy of Gyruda. Now, that token will have to be sacrificed after it enters the battlefield due to the legendary rule, but that's okay because in that creature entering, we've already accomplished what we need to. In the late game, this card is going to be absolutely nuts if we're able to pay that kicker cost. If we do that, that will amount to 5 Gyruda triggers, which is potentially game-ending depending on what we're able to get with it. We're actually running several cards that can copy Gyruda, such as Phantasmal Image, Spark Double, and Sakashima the Imposter. Phantasmal Image is just 2 mana to get an extra Gyruda trigger, which is fantastic. Again, we'll have to sacrifice the clone, but that's not all bad because our commander, Muldrotha, will allow us to cast it from our graveyard and do it again. Spark Double is a 4-mana clone that enters with an additional +1/+1 counter, and this clone is going to stick around because it won't be legendary. Sakashima the Imposter has a similar effect because it will enter as a copy of Gyruda, but its name will still be Sakashima the Imposter, so we won't have to sacrifice it to the legendary rule. It will also gain the ability to bounce it back to our hand for 4 mana, which means we can then cast it again and get another Gyruda trigger. We have even more copy cards in Blade of Selves, Bramble Sovereign, and Mirror Mockery. Blade of Selves is an equipment card that gives the equipped creature Myriad. So if we equip this creature to Gyruda and attack with him, we're going to create 2 additional copies of Gyruda, meaning this will put 2 triggers on the stack. That's a crazy amount of value. Mirror Mockery is similar to this, except it's an aura that will create a copy of Gyruda when it attacks. Bramble Sovereign is a staple in any deck that abuses ETB effects. If we have this on the battlefield and we're able to blink Gyruda, we can pay 1 green and 1 other to create a token that's a copy of Gyruda. So for 2 mana, we can create an additional Gyruda trigger. This isn't just good with Gyruda, this is good with any ETB effect that we're running in this deck. We're running 12 other creatures with ETB effects, and that's not including any of the clones we previously mentioned. Next up, we have Thassa Deep Dwelling. This is basically a Conjurer's Closet on a creature for 4 mana. So every turn we're going to get an additional ETB trigger for free. Panharmonicon is another fantastic card in this deck. This artifact doubles the number of ETB triggers we get out of our creatures. Last up is the first all-star of the deck. Deadeye Navigator is a 5/5 spirit creature for 2 blue and 4 other. It has Soul Bond, so whenever this or another creature enters the battlefield under our control, we can pair them together. Deadeye Navigator gives each of those creatures an activated ability for 1 blue and 1 other that blinks the creature. Needless to say, soul bonding this with Gyruda is going to be incredibly powerful, as we'll be able to repeat Gyruda's ETB trigger over and over again for just 2 mana each time. It's hard to imagine a situation where we're able to do this and we don't end up winning the game, or at the very least getting way ahead of our opponents. Again, this card isn't just good with Gyruda, it's also great with cards like Prime Speaker Zagana, Gonti, Lord of Luxury, Ravenous Chupacabra, and many others. There's no doubt in my mind that Deadeye Navigator is the best card in the deck. Now we know that mainly what we're trying to do with this deck is abuse Gyruda's ETB trigger, so let's talk about the creatures we really want to hit with this ability. We can run really high CMC creatures in this deck because Gyruda cheats them into play. One such creature is Vorinclex Voice of Hunger. This thing is nasty because it doubles the mana our lands produce and restricts our opponent's mana use. Razaketh the Foul-Blooded is another big nasty creature. This one allows us to tutor up any card from our deck, and all we have to do is pay 2 life and sacrifice a creature. Razaketh is one of those cards that will allow you to win games if it's not quickly dealt with. Next, we have some creatures that are going to draw us a boatload of cards. And 2 of those are Vilis, Broker of Blood, and Prime Speaker Zagana. Vilis' activated ability requires us to pay 1 black and 2 life to put a -1/-1 counter on a creature. He also says that whenever we lose life, we draw that many cards. So that activated ability is also going to draw us 2 cards each time we activate it. Jin Gitaxias, Core Augur, and Consecrated Sphinx are up next. Jin-Gitaxias draws us 7 cards at each of our end steps, which is sort of outrageous. Even worse, it makes all of our opponents discard to 0 at the end of their turn, save Reliquary Tower type effects. Consecrated Sphinx is a commander staple, and a great one at that. Whenever an opponent draws a card, we have the opportunity to draw 2 cards. This means no one will ever be able to surpass us in card advantage. This Sphinx draws us a minimum of 6 cards in a single rotation. Last in this category is Nauseous Gearhulk. When this creature enters the battlefield, we get to destroy a creature. And when we do, we gain life equal to that creature's toughness. Speaking of destroying creatures, let's go over some of the ways we're going to interact with our opponents. We already talked about Ravenous Chupacabra, Nauseous Gearhulk, and Vilis, which all have the ability to remove our opponent's creatures. Similar to these is Venser, Shaper Savant. This creature has an ETB that returns a spell or permanent to its owner's hand. Note that this says permanent. It doesn't even say non-land permanent. So if we're really able to repeat this effect, we can start returning our opponent's lands to their hand, which will often cause them to scoop immediately. Assassin's Trophy is here since it's 2 CMC and it can get rid of any permanent type at instant speed. Luckily, Cyclonic Rift is technically a 2 CMC instant, so that can be run in this deck too. Seal of Primordium is a solid removal spell in this deck as well. This one can only target artifacts or enchantments, but it's really good in this deck because this removal spell is on an enchantment. That means it can be recast once each turn if we have Muldrotha on the battlefield. We're also running a few counterspells in our deck. These are important mainly for protecting Gyruda from removal spells. Counterspell, Mana Drain, and Pact of Negation are all excellent options for this deck. Glenelendra Archmage is a fantastic card in this deck as well. This creature has Persist and an activated ability where we can pay 1 blue and sacrifice it to counter a non-creature spell. If we've already used this creature's ability once, we can blink it to bring it back without the -1/-1 counter, which will essentially reset it. It can also be cast from the graveyard with Muldrotha, which is awesome. Now we know that Gyruda is important to our strategy, and because of this, we need to have ways to get it out of the graveyard if it falls victim to a removal spell. We know our commander can do this, but assuming our commander isn't already on the battlefield, that's going to cost 12 mana to get Gyruda back. Animate Dead and Dance of the Dead are 2 ways to get Gyruda back for much, much cheaper. Both are 2 CMC enchantments that will bring Gyruda back directly to the battlefield for minor drawbacks. Entomber Exarch and Green Warden Marasa are 2 creatures with ETBs that can get Gyruda back from the graveyard. With Entomber Exarch, instead of returning a creature from our graveyard to our hand, we can choose to instead look at an opponent's hand and force them to discard a non-creature card of our choice. This is nice in case we draw into this card and we don't really need the first ability. Green Warden of Marasa is great because it not only has this recursion effect when it enters, but also when it dies. When it dies, if we exile it, we can use that ability again, which is nice. The last card in this deck that can get creatures back from our graveyard is Reap. This is like an instant speed regrowth that cares about how many black permanents our opponents control. So this has a chance to be a dead card in our hand, but it also may allow us to get multiple cards back from our graveyard. Now, although less likely, it is possible that Gyruda gets exiled. This is the last thing we want to happen, but unfortunately it can and will happen. We need to have some sort of answer for this. The only answer that there is for this, or at least that I know of, is Rift Sweeper. When Rift Sweeper enters the battlefield, we can take a face-up card from exile and shuffle it into our library. I really wish that it went into our hand, but again, this is the only option I know of that can remove a card from exile. Because of that, we'll need to follow up this creature with a tutor. We're running Demonic Tutor, the aforementioned Razaketh, and Finale of Devastation. Finale of Devastation is like Court of Calling, only it's sorcery speed, but we can also search our graveyard in addition to our library. It also has an added ability where if X is 10 or more, all of our creatures gain +X and haste until end of turn. That ability can sometimes end up being player removal, so this tutor spell is very, very powerful. As I've said before, we're running other permanents with ETB effects aside from Gyruda. Let's cover those and some of the other cards in the deck. First, we have a couple creature cards that draw us a card when they enter the battlefield. Wall of Blossoms and Fibblethip the Lost. Both of these are basically Elvish Visionary, although I like Wall of Blossoms better because it can safely block a 3/3, and I like Fibblethip better, well, basically just because it's Fibblethip. Baleful Strix and Coiling Oracle are similar, but these two have some upsides to them. Baleful Strix is a 1/1 with flying and death touch, so it's a fantastic blocker that will make your opponents think twice about swinging at you. Another noteworthy thing about this card is its synergy with Muldrotha. We can cast this card from our graveyard as an artifact, and that will allow us to play another creature card with Muldrotha from our graveyard in the same turn. Coiling Oracle doesn't just straight up draw a card. If that card happens to be a land, it goes directly onto the battlefield, so we might be able to ramp with this card as well. Next up is Guardian Project. We're going to have tons of creatures entering the battlefield in this deck, so this enchantment is going to generate a lot of card draw. Notion Thief is a great creature and probably one that's a bit underplayed. This guy negates our opponent's card draw and turns it into card draw for us. It has Flash too, so we can catch an opponent by surprise if they decide to cast a Pull from Tomorrow or something like that. Now we have one more thing to cover with this deck, and that's the utility lands. First up is Cavern of Souls. It's important that Gyruda resolves, which is why we're running this land. When this enters, the creature type to name is Demon, as we have 3 of those in our deck and only 1 Kraken. Fetid Pools and Zagoth Triome both enter tapped but have cycling, so they can replace themselves in the late game. Mortuary Mire, Witch's Cottage, and Volrath's Stronghold are up next. All of these lands have the ability to put a creature card from our graveyard on top of our library. This will allow us to set up our Gyruda trigger to hit a specific creature from our graveyard. Nurturing Peatland and Waterlogged Grove can both be sacrificed in the late game for card draw, and at that point can be replayed from our graveyard with Muldrotha. Strip Mine can be sacrificed to destroy an opponent's land, and again can be replayed with Muldrotha. Temple of Deceit, Temple of Malady, and Temple of Mystery allow us to scry when they enter, which will increase our odds of hitting a good creature with Gyruda's trigger. Temple of the False God is a great land in this deck because if it's the 5th land that we play, that will put us to 6 mana, which is our sweet spot since both Gyruda and Muldrotha cost 6 mana. Well, that'll do it for today's deck tech. What did you think? Is the companion mechanic worth building around now? What cards would you add to this deck? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss out on any new deck techs. You can also follow us on Twitter at TheManaFixMTG. Thanks for getting your fix with me today, stay safe out there, and peace out, guys.